Welcome everybody to the London Stories ongoing series of webcasts and live webinars commemorating historical events, but linking them to relevant issues to us today. Today is the 26th of January, India's Republic Day. In 1950, India officially became an independent republic. A very important day for India, the 26th of January, because in 1930, for the first time, the Indian National Congress announced the intent to complete freedom for India. So exactly 20 years later, we ratified our constitution and became an independent republic. Two facts about our constitution before we start. One, the Constitution of India is handwritten. The original constitution is handwritten in two languages. Two documents, one in Hindi, one in English, and every page has a little annotation, a little painting or a sketch from artists, senior artists from Shantiniketan in Calcutta. It's a beautiful, beautiful documents. In addition to that, the Constitution itself, the original one, 395 articles, but Article 1.1 begins the Constitution with India, that is Bharat, giving it two official names. It's one of the only constitutions that does that. And the reason for that is that Bharat is the root of India. It's India's history, its culture, its entire being. And India is the modern version where we are going to take it, where we are going to develop and take the old and mix it with the new, which is a democratic, secular, a progressive future, fighting for its place as leadership in the world, fighting towards being part of the technological leaders of the world. But have we, over the last 71 years, gone forward, or are we sort of wavering a bit? Are we the only ones? I mean, there's so many countries going through the same. Our topic for today, democracy and the rule of law. And we have three eminent speakers here. We'll start with Simone Filippini, a senior ambassador. She then headed CODE, one of the largest NGOs in the Netherlands, and took over briefly as the director of the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy. She's now embarked on an ambitious project called Leadership for SDGs, and we will always wish her the best for that. Simone, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much. And for all the Indian visitors, congratulations on your Republic's Independence Day. It's important, and I think the notions that you just already mentioned, democratic, secular, inclusive, are of course extremely important related to the issues that we will speak about today. I will touch upon a number of issues, but not too much on the situation in India. I think that Fredrik and Manzoor have a lot to say about that also, but to go more in depth into a certain number of issues. So I will touch upon them and then we can go into discussion, because I think that's also the idea. We have a Q&A and a discussion, and we elucidate some aspects if needed. So just to say that it may be like an open door, but rule of law is not some theoretical issue. And we feel it basically nearly physically every single day. It's part and parcel of a well-functioning democracy. So it's about proper legislation, a well-functioning judiciary, independent, well-trained and professional judges, consistent law enforcement with respect for human and civil rights are all part of judiciary. Integrity, trust are key words. We can see from this recent situation in the US how important all those aspects are to uphold a democratic system. Also important within a democratic system, a rule of law, are properly trained civil servants able to provide pushback to the political forces within departments, within ministries, to come up with independent advice and proper solutions. So different types of solutions for different issues, so that they can come up with a serious advice and not be pushed from above. A recent good example, I think, is the recent case of the Deputy Attorney General in the US, acting Attorney General in the US, Mr. Rosen, who was nearly forced by Mr. Trump to give in to his wish to undo the election outcome in Georgia. And thanks to the resistance of Mr. Rosen and his top other colleagues, this didn't fly. And I think that's an important example of how important an institutional setup, the quality of the civil servants can be for upholding democracy, even against very strong and powerful political forces. The rule of law is, as we all know, also dependent on politics and can be undermined by politics and politicians. And that's not always very open, an open process. It can be an undercurrent, hidden attacks on democracy, but also a result of incompetence of civil servants and politicians to properly come up with solutions. But think, for example, of Mr. Orban in Hungary, part of the European Union, very strong human rights-based and civic rights-based constitution, where he has been able to attack media, the rule of law, judges, anyone related to independently uphold democracy, and finding scapegoats wherever he could look for them. It's interesting if you look at these types of issues. There's this book, The Dictator's Handbook. Probably you know, or some of you might know the book, and it describes what we see happening in the world in quite some countries. Undermining media, undermining judges, constantly questioning the independence and quality of institutions. So setting up people up against one another, drowning the voice of the nuance in a majority-led dominant opinion that doesn't leave space for others to come up with their ideas. And sometimes it's also a small minority that yells just much harder than anyone else and gets a lot of attention in media. There's a lot of criticism, for example, in a country like the Netherlands at this moment, related to this issue, that there's disproportionate attention for a disproportionately small group of people with, for example, conspiracy theories, but also promoting a very specific interpretation of facts that's not very fact-based, etc. And it's quite scary for many people to see how those conspiracy theories flourish and how they influence many well-intentioned people who don't properly have access to a lot of different sources of news, or are not able, or have no time maybe, to interpret them properly, and also to seek diverse sources to nuance their opinion making. I also saw, because some people say, hey, do you think people are stupid? No, of course I don't think people are stupid, but it's a very sly and mean kind of process. I really can recommend a great article on how this process of luring people into conspiracy theories and into the algorithms that surround them, how it works. It's a game designer's analysis of QAnon by Reed Berkowitz. He describes it very properly and very understandably. So how do we promote resistance against conspiracy theories, hate speech, fake news, hoax talks, etc.? The rule of law, of course, is one aspect of this, reinforcement, equal access to independent judiciary, all these issues. But also we have to acknowledge that there are some underlying factors that you see as a kind of global breeding ground for these types of beliefs. And that those are real ones that affect real people. It's about exclusion, poverty, inequality, corruption, lack of opportunities of many people in societies. And the COVID pandemic has laid those issues even more bare than they were already visible. Many people suffer disproportionately of COVID-19, and that increased the breeding ground of propagandists. So you see that governments in many countries have not found proper answers to the issues that affect the working class, working people. I think that the other two speakers will also go into this issue. And it's the government that has to build the enabling environment for inclusive socio-economic development, but also sustainable peace in societies. Blaming others is then a system and a kind of approach, a propagandist approach that sustains certain leaders, even if they're doing, in objective terms, really badly. And often what you also see is that leaders sometimes start off really well-intentioned as well, but they derail. And I think that is why I started also the Leadership for SDGs initiative, because I think there are many well-intentioned leaders who don't know how to do things. They don't have the expertise, the experience, or the skills to lead their countries to build that enabling environment. It's very hard. The challenges are huge and growing, and they don't get the support that they deserve and that they need. And it's a really interesting issue, or an interesting question. Why are all CEOs and boards of companies being trained and coached and supported? And everybody thinks this is a totally normal issue and very needed, because we need the best leaders around. And then government leaders and governments don't have that support. It seems a logical thing, but it isn't apparently, because it doesn't exist. So I saw that when I traveled the world, both as a diplomat, as the director of CORDATE, and the director of the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy, I saw that so many governments are struggling. They have not been raised in a way that enables them to come up with the right results. They're stuck in a system. So something really dramatic needs to happen there, systemic change. And that requires support. And then one other issue, of course, which is very important at the same time, is bottom-up pressure. So the bottom-up pressure from inside societies and the top-down change that enables also leaders to interact in a more productive and constructive way with their citizens, without becoming defensive, but open to the wisdom of the huge wisdom out there of the crowd, are, I think, two ways how to tackle challenges at this moment in terms of democracy and the rule of law. I will leave it at that for now and hand back the words to Imran and Manzoor and Fredrik, and we'll have a discussion later on.
Thank you, Simone. Moving immediately to the next person speaking, we'll now have Fredrik Galtung. Fredrik is the CEO now of an organization called TrueFootprint. He has been part of Transparency International, one of the first employees of Transparency International. He played a major role in putting together the Corruption Perception Index. He after that started something called Integrity Action, TIRI, where he did more work on the implementation of anti-corruption strategies. He's worked in over 40 countries, dealt with senior people in countries, leaders and heads of state as well. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Fredrik. The floor is yours. You have to unmute. You're muted. Fredrik?
Yeah, the organizer had to unmute me.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry.
Imran, thank you so much for bringing us together. Thanks to all of you for participating, and the London story and the amazing work you are doing there. But on this occasion and today, let me congratulate you Indians on Republic Day. You have the longest constitution in the world, or at least one of them. And so I didn't know it had all these beautiful illustrations. But of course, you also have one of the most successful constitutions in the post-colonial world, in the sense that it survived, very simply. And that's a remarkable achievement. But this is not simply an occasion to pat oneself on the back. This is also a time to reflect. And so from the world's biggest democracy, to the state of democracy in the world, what are things looking like, right? Is this a time for celebration or concern? And certainly not everything is quite as we would like it in many regards. So the case I'm going to make is that it's a time now of actually tremendous concern. That we saw the shenanigans in the US, but we also see many disturbing phenomena happening in India. And so let me reflect on just a few points. So according to Freedom House, we have 15 consecutive years of decline in the state of democracy in the world. 14 years in a row. So this didn't start yesterday, right? And I just want to make the following arguments and cases to you. So one is that I want to look at this from the point of view of subjective sentiments to democracy and some of the factors that explain the success of the far right and the majoritarian right in various parts of the world. And why we have to be introspective about this if we are on the progressive side of the equation, believing still that democracy has a role to play. So when we look at attitudes of youth around the world to democracy, it's already a very worrying picture. What we find is that youth around the world are less and less attracted by democracy. If you ask the question, as Yasha Monk and his colleague Foa did in an article they published in the Journal of Democracy, if you look at by age cohort how people feel about democracy and whether it's essential to live in a democracy, people born in the 30s and 40s, the graph goes straight down. So people who are in their 80s and 90s believe it's extremely important and essential to live in a democracy. But young people born in the 80s and 90s do not believe it's essential. Now, how big is the gap? So for example, in Sweden, some 80% of the elderly think it's essential, and just around 60% of the young thinks it's essential. But if we go to countries that we might not expect, the US, 75% of the elderly think it's essential, but just over 25% of the young think it's essential. In Britain, it's similar. It's a bit under 75% of the old think it's essential, and just over 25% of the young. Now, here's where this is really worrying, is that it's also connected with people believing that authoritarianism is a pretty good idea. And this trend occurred in Eastern Europe before it's happened in Western Europe, for example. And it correlates perfectly with the rise of majoritarian, populist, right-wing parties in those countries. Those countries which saw the fall of the Berlin Wall happen just a few years before, but that age group, that cohort that's born after the wall fell down, is the least likely to think that democracy really matters. And here's my second bit of evidence that I want to bring to this, which is a subjective index done of democracy. So subjective in the following sense is that it's not looking at the rule of law, it's not looking at electoral practices, but it's looking at a few criteria that I guess we could all agree are important in a democracy, which is, do people trust in the institutions? Do they think that they are represented, that their interests are represented by government, that government is responsive to them, and that government responds to people's needs? On those criteria, one of the countries that does the best in the world, it's not a little bit better, it does among the best in the world, is China. So on this subjective democracy index, the US does very badly. Even Taiwan, Japan do not do well. And China's trust ratio is the same as Holland. So we are now in a situation, 14 years of decline. The youth no longer believe that democracy matters that much. And in fact, they have more radical views on the left and the right than their parents did at the same age. And that their grandparents did at the same age. So it's not simply a generational thing, it's a cohort. Now, the proposition I want to put to you is that this is a failure of liberals. It's a failure of progressives in so many respects. What you find now is that, and I'll finish on this, I could go on, of course, but is you find that Trump in 2016 was elected by the working class in the US, while financed, of course, by billionaires. The Brexit vote in 2016 was won by the working class and people living in rural areas, while being financed by millionaires and billionaires. The millionaires and billionaires don't have enough votes. But it happens to be that the Labour Party in the UK and the Democratic Party in the US are no longer the party at all of the working class of those countries. And the same has happened in Scandinavia, it's happened in Israel, it's happened in various other parts of the world. And so that disconnect is progressives no longer represent the interests of the people who feel marginalized by the current economic order. And so these factors coming together with a youth bulge that is not voting, because they're actually not voting. They don't believe in democracy, and they're showing that by not voting. We're at a time of really profound difficulty, an enormous challenge. And if we continue pointing the finger at the Trumps of this world and saying they're the problem, then we are guaranteed to be heading towards failure. That's it. Those are my first remarks.
Yeah.
Over to you, Imran.
Thank you. And I'm going to now invite Manzoor. Manzoor was also with Transparency International for a while. Manzoor Hasan is a barrister. He has been associated with BRAC, the largest NGO in the world, for quite a few years. And at present, he is heading the Center for Peace and Justice. Manzoor was given an OBE for his contribution towards transparency and accountability in Bangladesh. Manzoor, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Imran, and again, congratulations to our Indian friends on the Republic Day, and it's really a huge achievement in many ways for India to have reached this particular place, and there's all of us to learn from what has happened in India over the last 70 odd years. But I'd like to sort of start by saying that as our previous speakers have pointed out, rule of law principles really goes to the fabric of democracy, but it is really one of the many factors that we have to take into consideration. And as Simone mentioned, that it's not just a theoretical principle, but it's something which has to be applied in many ways. And this is something that, and I suppose we are looking at this this evening or today, when discussing this whole issue of democracy, democratic governance, and how it has evolved over the years. I mean, I would say that the democracy project is relatively young in many ways, if we look at it. And I mean, there's a couple of figures I would like to just cite. Before 1970, 1/3 of world states were democratic countries, democracies. After 1970, by 2010, over half of the countries of the states, world states, became electoral democracies. So there was a kind of expansion of democracy. The project was quite active and was quite successful. And Western liberal democracies became shining beacons and became a model for many. In many ways, as we know. But as Fredrik was saying, that there is, I think, now a serious threat to this. And I would say that the threat is both internal and external. I mean, the external threat, I would say, is coming from China, countries which have very tight political control, and they are actually also growing at a very fast rate. And it's really attractive for many leaders in the third world countries, in the developing countries, because it's a very efficient way of actually running a country. Because at the end of the day, you really don't have to bother with much debate, change of direction in policies, and there's really very little uncertainty when you have a system of that kind. And there's, in a way, very little accountability and participation. And this is the kind of the external factor, I would say, that many democracies, and I call these the democracies which emerged since 1970, I call them the semi-democracies. So they really see China as a very attractive model to follow. That's the external threat. The internal threat, I would say, and Fredrik has actually highlighted this, which is the kind of the failure of the globalization process, which has created, as he mentioned, as Fredrik mentioned, rising inequality, the big money politics, partisan vested groups, and social media all coming together, creating a kind of serious fragility within itself. So those two things coming together over the last decade or so has created a huge shift, I would say. And the shift that I see is a spectrum which starts on one end of the spectrum as a senior democracies to semi-democracies to subverted democracies. So really, in many ways, I see the process actually going towards subverted democracies in many ways. You see the senior ones, and if we look at the UK and the USA as examples, we see the changes which are taking place, and we have recently seen what's happened in the USA, and the political bankruptcy of the UK in many ways shows how senior democracies can actually move towards semi-democracies. And today I was reading an article where Mr. Gordon Brown was talking about failed state in terms of the UK, which is quite an interesting. I thought that it was actually quite an exaggerated sort of diagnosis of the UK, but he did use the word failed democracy. And also, we also see the shift, as I would say, from in a country like India, which I would put in the semi-democracy category, moving towards a subverted democracy sort of category. Because in many ways, the institutions are not failing, are failing. Accountability factors is becoming low. Rule of law is becoming rather weak. Mega corruption, grand corruption is increasing. It's not just India. In many other countries, we see these things are happening. So really, how do we check this? How do we bring this to an end? In many ways, I think that this is not just a top-down approach, a solution that can come from the top and resolve this problem. I think in many ways, it's got to be a bottom-up approach, and it's a threat that philosophers like Plato and others foresaw, that when democracy is controlled by a small group, an oligarchy, then I think the fruits of democracy can be undermined, and I think it can move towards dictatorship. So even Churchill, I think, mentioned that democracy is not the best form of government that we can have, but it's probably the best of the worst that we can have. So it's not a perfect solution to the problems that we have, but it's something that needs to be nurtured. And that nurturing, I think, in many ways, has to come from education, from civic education, from a reconfiguration of politics in many ways. I mean, in many of these semi-democracies, over the last 10 years, what we have seen is that politics has become extremely confrontational. And it's not just semi-democracies, it's also senior democracies like the USA. Over the last 4 years under Donald Trump, we have seen the politics changing from a more compromised politics to confrontational politics. And these are issues that we have to be resolved. And this is not going to be resolved overnight. I think this will take time. But I personally feel that, by saying that democracy doesn't work, I feel in a way we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I think we need to look at the whole issue and really put our heads together and hear not just from the senior democratic countries or the semi, but I think across the board, there has to be coalition and in a way, a concerted effort to regain the democratic space that we have lost over the last 10, 15 years. I'll stop at that, Imran. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manzoor. Thank you, all of you. I'm now going to open the chat part of our discussion as well, because we had to lock it because unfortunately we have people that think it's important to create problems for us over here. We've got a few people creating a few things here, but doesn't matter. Now we've opened it up, and please ask your questions over there. And we look forward to being able to put them together and ask. I think Simone wants to say something. So Simone, why don't you begin?
Yeah, basically, I really like, of course, the interventions by Manzoor and Fredrik. I think they're really rich. And I would like to ask a few questions on this. That is, Fredrik, you talked about the Brexit was won by the working class votes funded by the billionaires and millionaires. Basically, people were like cheated and lied into believing something that just wasn't true. And so, and for me, I constantly have the impression that far-right forces are simplifying messages in a way that people are lured into believing them. And they're surrounding them by lots of rich social media context so that they constantly come across those same messages. So I would like to ask you how you feel about this. And then maybe Manzoor, about democracies after the 70s. What I see is that there are many democracies in the world. Well, basically, they're theoretical democracies. So they call themselves democracies, but basically, the only democratic thing that happens there is that they hold elections, and those elections are rigged. And the book, How to Rig an Election by Brian Klaas and Nick Cheeseman, probably you know the book, also explains very easily how that system works. So they pretend to be democracies, but that's just a very superficial thing. And the lack of accountability internationally, in international circles, to hold leaders accountable to non-performance on democratic terms that they signed up to. I would like to hear what you think about this.
Thank you so much, Simone, for having these wonderfully challenging questions. So, of course, you are right, is that there have been terrible lies and disinformation and misinformation and coming from various of these movements. And let's just stick to Brexit, right? There was very clear cases of that. And perhaps it should have been caught by one authority or the other, the electoral authority. They wondered whether they could intervene. They thought they shouldn't intervene. The Advertising Standards Authority, again, but by the time that went through the motions, the election had already happened. The referendum had already happened. But let us not kid ourselves that the progressive left also tells lies and misinformation in various ways. And as far as people on the margins experience it, there are certain things that simply aren't true. And I'm not talking about climate change deniers. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about, for example, globalization, free trade. That's going to be good for you. It's fantastic for the middle class. It's fantastic for businesses. The middle class gets to shop wines and cheese, right, that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. But for many workers, it's not so brilliant. And then this notion, for example, that diversity is going to be transformative. Diversity, we're celebrating now, indeed, a woman of Indian origin being vice president of the US. Fantastic. But diversity at the top has gone hand in hand with rising inequality in the US. Diversity at the top does not mean that it changes the system in any significant way.
Not that it becomes inclusive in the policies.
Exactly. That's right. And so there are notions that have been too facile, too simple, right? And that really left many, many, many people behind. And what the far right is giving people, they're giving them a few things. They're giving them pride, a sense of community, an agency. What is more agency than storming the Capitol? And they're being seen, right? Trump saw them, gave them recognition. And what I'm suggesting to you is that progressives no longer see these people, right? They're no longer, after all, they don't vote for them, right? They lost them a long time ago. So there is a disconnect which we have to see if we can reconnect with, because if we don't, we're on a losing battle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Fredrik, Manzoor, you're, one sec. Let me see if I have to unmute you, or you're muted.
I can unmute myself. Sorry, Simone. I agree totally in terms of the democracies that we talked about since the 1970s. I mean, they have basically, I mean, this is why I call them semi-democracies. I mean, they are in form democratic, but in substance, they are not. And basically, I mean, what they have done is they have had elections every 4 or 5 years, and basically, you know, kind of, other than that, there hasn't been really much of an entrenchment in terms of democratic principles within the system themselves. But the fact is that, I mean, if I just talk about Bangladesh as an example, I mean, 1990, when military dictatorship was removed and we had a civilian government and elections took place, and that happened, and elections have been happening ever since then. I mean, we've tried basically to develop those institutions and the norms and the principles, but the nature of politics is such in Bangladesh or in many other countries that it is very much confrontational in nature. I mean, the accommodation, the compromise is missing. And because of that, I mean, it has created a dysfunctional system. And in many ways, I mean, it's, as I said, it's a kind of a democracy which is only by name, and in substance, it's something else. Now, this is something which requires political vision, political leadership, and it's something that cannot be imposed from outside. It has to develop from within. And this is why I said earlier on that it has to be bottom-up approach, and there has to be a lot more investment from within the country that has to happen for a kind of more organic democracy to be established in a country like Bangladesh or many other such semi-democracies, which I say can easily be move into kind of subverted democracies, which in other words basically could be a dictatorship in a different guise itself, you know, but with facade of a democracy. So it's something I think in a way cannot be dealt with in a short period of time. And as I said, external, internal fragilities are there. And for a country like Bangladesh, for example, climate change is going to be a huge threat. The refugees who've come in from Myanmar is a huge threat, which undermines the progress. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize the fact that some of these countries have actually improved a lot of their people quite a lot in terms of social indicators. For example, if you see what Bangladesh has done over the last 40 years, it's amazing. I mean, if I may say so, it has surpassed India in many ways. So, I mean, so it's not a kind of a broad brush approach that we should have. I think it's more nuanced picture that we see, and we need to recognize and also give credit to both the people and the politicians for what they have achieved. Thank you.
But maybe one last point from my side before the floor, because I think it's an important point which often is not being brought to the fore so much. It's the role of big money in politics. I lived in Miami for 2 years, and I was amazed by the role of big dollars in American politics at all levels. To become a judge, to become this, to become a commissioner, to become that. If you would have $2 million, deal done, right? And so it's constant give and take. So lawyers firms, one partner gives to the Democrat, one to the Republican. So how do you look at that? So that also is very undermining for serious, inclusive democratic systems, I think. And I would really love to hear your perspective on, for example, a country like India, where also I think the role of big funding in politics and the corruption that accompanies this is an important issue in undermining the democratic system, or am I totally wrong there?
Just before you answer that, Fredrik also wanted to just put a question to Simone. So we can do that, answer this, and then we've got some questions which we'll go to then after that.
Yeah. Simone, your question is of course profound, but on an attempt to sway this in perhaps a positive direction, there is a deep discussion going on in so many quarters about reinventing capitalism, right? Capitalism is no longer fit for purpose. It has to become more regenerative, sustainable, circular. And this is a discussion happening in so many countries, indeed, and developing, rich, less rich. Do we need something similar to happen around democracy and the rule of law? And if so, right, what could that look like? Or is it a question, Emil Pellicer is talking about a nostalgia for an idealistic past. I mean, should we actually be trying to revive what we had before, or do we need to reinvent certain things?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, can you see the question that Emil has posted as well on the right? If you look at it, talking about nostalgia of the So can we answer his question? He's of course asking specifically about India, but I think this is cross-cutting. It goes to many different parts of the world, and how the sort of movements today, more populist movements, are talking about their wonderful past and how they can achieve that.
Well, I think the Brexit is a fantastic example.
But that's what he's given the examples of the US and the UK. But what about other countries? What about the Netherlands or somebody else?
Well, I think the Netherlands, people know that we had a relatively glorious past, but that has been long past, and we don't see ourselves as parts of that glorious past still.
Yeah, but the populist movements do talk about retaining culture and retaining the past. So this is
more identity politics.
Yeah, it's all across the board. I mean, that's what's happening in India. That's what's happening in many countries now. Yeah. Can we? And please, on Fredrik's question as well, Simone. No, you.
No. Yeah, I think like in the Netherlands, it's different from, for example, in the UK. I think in the UK there's still lots of people who believe in this really glorious past. They of course have the Commonwealth, 54 countries. That is now their new path to maybe new glory or importance or stature in the world. We don't have that. We are simple. The Dutch, in the end, are people who live in a very low country, below sea level. We have to survive and get ourselves with our heads above the water, and we are quite practical and pragmatic. So we don't have those lofty ideas of this glorious past that we have to revive. Yes, some politicians try to come up with some ideas as to the great Dutch identity, but we all know that, we have very different identities. And yeah, some people, go into that trap, but most, I think, really don't believe it. So but it's always, I see, though, I don't want to deny this totally, but it's of a different quality. I think it's more like insecurity of people looking at an insecure world as not very, a bit of a fragile world, which they cannot oversee. They feel helpless and without control. And so that makes them vulnerable for all kinds of stupid ideas as to identity, the Dutch identity. Well, it has never existed, it doesn't exist now, but this is what is being fed into people. That is is not so much about our glorious past, but the Dutch identity, that we have always been inclusive Democrats and tolerant, which is totally not true. We have developed into the right direction, yes, but we haven't been like that always. So I think for every country it's quite specific.
We have another question from Shivam, very interesting. Historically, how vulnerable have democracies been due to populism and majoritarianism? I'd like all three of you to touch on that, but I just want to add to that, and it might actually fit into what Emil is saying too. Just a theory, and I'd like to throw it out there and see what you have to say. A lot of the majoritarian or these populist political parties. I'll give the example of India so that we can go from there. When this party came to power, one of the things they said was Congress Mukt Bharat. Congress Mukt Bharat means an India without the Congress party anymore. He wanted to get rid of the Congress party completely. What he has achieved is actually a BJP Mukt Bharat as well, which is he's got rid of the BJP as a political party. He's actually got rid of traditional politics from Indian politics. And these parties now in power, whether it is the Republicans with Trump or it's Orban or it's whatever, they've become a little different. Like in India, this is now a socio-religious movement with 130, 140 million members, growing rapidly. And what happens is, how do you tackle somebody like that? Because you tackle them politically. So you talk about things that are politically important, like a price rise, like jobs, like healthcare. And these people don't care because Hindutva is their aim. They are a socio-religious movement. If you counter what they say, it isn't dissent, political dissent, it's blasphemy, and therefore they have the right to kill you. How do you see that? And how do you see us getting away from that? We've got away from it in the US just by moving a leader, but the people, 75 million, still exist. How do you see that moving away in the rest of the world? Can we start with you, Fredrik? Because I think you will, and then we can go to Manzoor and with Simone, if you're okay with that. Fredrik?
Well, thanks, Imran, for giving me indeed the toughest question, but thank you. No, this is such an important point, right? And no jokes aside, is I think this is truly existential because, as you say, it taps into something very, very deep. So I said, it's giving people a sense of identity, of community, of agency, right? And they are seen, they are recognized for something. And in India, it could be about recognizing people who are backward caste as well as being part of a Hindutva whole, etc. So this is very, very difficult. But all the more so, there needs to be a counterpoint. There needs to be a credible alternative. And you know, when the Dear Congress Party in India, when it tried to do its, you know, I mean, just on this one little point, it tried to do social media outreach, right? And mobilization on the ground, and it turned out that it was falsified data. The new members of the Congress Party were fake. So when you have as little rigor, as little grounding in the base as to generate fake membership numbers, you have a problem. Of course, there's no alternative under those conditions. And so, yes, it's scary. It's absolutely scary to have such a counterpoint. You know, one can wait and look at the watch and hope that they will unravel themselves. But that doesn't necessarily happen. And the amount of damage that can be done in the process is absolutely tremendous. So the face of certain countries is being changed in that process. And again, I put the blame very significantly at the lack of a credible alternative. Because for so many people, they do ultimately want so many decent things in their lives. But when those things don't exist, yes, it's very easy to revert to this.
Thanks, Fredrik. Manzoor, I'd like to hear your opinion on that, if you could, because we'll then go to Simone after that. I think you're still muted.
Yeah.
Manzoor, you're still muted.
Okay, I'm not doing this.
No, sorry. No, it's because of
that's perfectly fine. But Fredrik, I agree. I mean, in the sense that, you know, lack of credible opposition is a very, very important issue. But at the same time, I think, you know, I take a sort of less pessimistic view in the sense that if you look at history, I mean, politics is not a linear process. I mean, there's been ups and downs over the centuries, and democracy as a project, I would say, is relatively young, and it's going to grow. And I feel that, you know, the optimism that I have comes from the youth. I mean, a country like Bangladesh or India, you know, the youth population is huge, and they are the people who will take us forward. Obviously, there will have to be new leadership coming coming forward and taking the mantle of politics and move forward. But there has to be a reconfiguration of politics at the same time. I mean, for example, electoral system, first past the post, is a disaster for many countries in terms of, you know, it creates majority rule, and then it destroys the rest. I mean, this is what we have seen in many countries. So this first past the post system has to be replaced by other forms of electoral process. I mean, you have something in Israel or many other European countries, PR, but that also creates a lot of factional politics. So there's no ideal answer or solution to this problem, but I feel that we are certainly going through a huge crisis at the moment. But I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully with COVID, there's a lot of these kind of cracks which are appearing, which we'll have to deal with. And I think there will have to be a real serious rethinking in terms of how do we take this forward. And I just hope, as you were saying, Fredrik, that there will be new faces coming, credible opposition coming up, and a real contestation that will happen, which will produce more vibrant politics, more sort of fruitful, engaging politics that will take us forward. I mean, that's the vision that I have for the future.
Simone, there's a specific question for you as well. So with the answer for this, I think it linked, you saw it. Okay, so please go ahead.
Yeah, now maybe a few things. I was thinking if India and the majoritarianism of the present day system, I was thinking of the situation in Russia at the moment and the role of somebody like Navalny, who is very courageous. I don't say he's the best Democrat in the world. I don't even know that, but he's courageous, he's sharp, he's intelligent. He provides an alternative narrative on which he's very consistent. Because I totally believe, Fredrik, what you also say, that it comes up with a sense of agency, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. Had this story of right-wing identity politics. So people feel reinforced, they feel like empowered. And so I think one of the issues is that you need a countervailing dream, a countervailing perspective for people to be able to believe in. And I think that democratic parties, social democratic parties, have failed to come up, or real liberal parties have failed to come up with that alternative dream, that people can hold on to this vision of a beautiful future that they can believe in as much as the others can believe now in some stupid conspiracy theory, for example. And I don't say that what right-wing politicians say is all stupid. So that's not the case, but those extremes. And then the reconfiguration of the system, yeah, that probably is very, very difficult. It does certainly not go in an automatic manner, because the people who have a stake at holding up that system, they will, at all costs, will keep it in place. What I think, for example, and you can think of them whatever you want, but like an agenda like Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN, a very ambitious agenda to which all countries have committed themselves. If that would be implemented in the right manner, I think that might really make a difference, because it's practical. It's about issues that need to change in people's lives. It's about fighting poverty, fighting exclusion, promoting gender equality, promoting access to affordable, high quality education for all. Same thing for health, fighting climate change, all kinds of issues that are really important for people, and including SDG 16, which is about peaceful societies and strong and well-functioning institutions, lack of, so fight against corruption, and SDG 17, which is about partnerships between all different parties who should be on board. If that agenda would be implemented based on the principles that it, according to principles it was based on, human rights centered approach, that might make a difference. And what I have seen over the past 5 years, the agenda lags behind. Okay, but I've seen the power of this agenda growing much more so than the Millennium Development Goals. And I think what is a key issue here is accountability. You see the permanent members of the UN Security Council not being accountable to what they have to be, what they have to stand for. You see that many countries are not accountable or displaying accountability to what they have committed to what they have signed up to, the SDGs, for example. And you can hold countries accountable, then it becomes more practical. So you try via a practical entry point, better healthcare for all, better education for all, civic education for all these types of issues to contribute also to a change of a cultural change of society from within. I think that's important. Also goes for the Netherlands. We are now going to introduce a civic education for all kids. I'm also the president of the United Nations Association of the Netherlands, and we really contributed to getting this into the new curriculum for schools, because it's super important to teach children that multilateralism is important, that cooperation between countries is crucial to solve the issues of the 21st century, that we cannot do things alone, that the Netherlands outside of the European Union is next to nothing. You know, we can't get anything done. So I think these are some aspects that we could try to work on. Accountability based on SDG implementation, and for example, in the case of India or any country, hold them accountable. See what Urgenda has done in the Netherlands, you know, the well-known Urgenda case. The Netherlands committed to the climate goals, then they didn't live up to them, and then there was a court case and the judge said, hey, Netherlands government, you are obliged to implement what you have signed up to. There was it was known all over the world. It was published all over the world. It was a unique case. And like we now see in some countries, I think in India even, rivers, nature getting legal personality so that governments can be held accountable to destroying the natural environment of the country, which is basically property of all, you know, it's a common good.
Yep, thank you, Simone. Unfortunately, yeah, this is what happens when you're having a great conversation, you start running out of time. So I'm going to throw one last thing and have all of you finish with that. You brought up Navalny in Russia, and that's very interesting. We again, we started with India. We'll end the last question with India again. Unfortunately, the commitment of most countries to tackle the issues in India seems to be extremely diluted. They will attack Russia, they will attack China, they will attack Iran. But when it comes to India, the voices are far more muted. We have today a farmers' strike happening in India. We have several Navalny's locked up just now. Dynamic, incredible people lying in jail for up to a year and a half now. And nobody has said anything. Navalny has got headline news everywhere with every news media outlet covering everything and being allowed, by the way, to cover the riots, the demonstrations there, just as even in China and Hong Kong, allowed to cover them, and they interviewed people. Nobody can do that in Kashmir. We've had exactly the same thing happen in Kashmir and nobody has said anything. Exactly the same. Special status, Hong Kong, Kashmir. Kashmiri, all the politicians were locked up. Nobody was allowed to say anything. And nobody in the Western world has said a word. Nobody covered it. And so this also plays a very big part. Yeah, of course, we would love for people to come up and leadership to emerge. But if people are going to judge who they're going to attack based on their own economic interests, that too, there has to be some responsibility on that front too. We'd like to end with that. So why don't we start with you, Manzoor? Then we'll get Simone to have a chat and do the final with Fredrik, if you're okay. So Manzoor.
Thank you, Imran. I mean, I think this is, I mean, obviously the failure of the fourth estate, the fact that, you know, the media houses are also now heavily controlled and dominated by the wealthy rich, and they basically do not allow this kind of debate, as you've just said, to happen. So I think there has to be, again, a kind of a reconfiguration in terms of media outlet. I mean, we've seen this happening over the last 4 years in the USA, the way the media has kind of not been sort of fair in its coverage. So I think, you know, again, I mean, we talk about freedom of information, freedom of speech, right to publicize and you know, sort of and write whatever we want to do. But can we really do that? But that's the question I really put to all of us. I don't think we can. So there is this serious sort of deficiency here in terms of the press, and that needs to be tackled. And again, like what are all the other things that we have discussed today, it's not going to be there's not going to be an overnight sort of change happening, but there has to be democratization of media itself, control of media, not by a small group of wealthy people in different parts of the world, but by the citizens themselves. So I think, again, we have to think, how do we reconfigure that? Until and unless we manage to do that, we won't be able to talk about the kind of things you've just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Simone?
Yeah, I just, a few things I would like to say is that I think we should take a long-term perspective, integral approach, basically, because you cannot change only one issue and then expect a more all-encompassing outcome. Create best practices, start where the potential is. I think, for example, a country like India is super difficult. If you look at the entire country, maybe there are some states in which you have leadership that is willing and able to become an example of systemic change. There are always good people around, well-intentioned people, good people who want to make a positive difference for the common good. And then, because the people who have this very strong hold on power at central level, they won't let go so easily. So I think look for countries, for example, that are potentially productive examples of the change that can happen, and spread the word also. I mean, in any country things need to happen, right? But in the meantime, look for best practices and share them, inspire, give hope, make people also bottom up hope for people so that they stick to what they try to do, because it's very harsh out there sometimes. And but there are no easy solutions for very complex problems, that's for sure.
Dear Imran, is there a double standard in international politics? Yes, there 100% is. But does it make a difference is the question, right? If Biden were to complain about the state of democracy in India today, does the US really have lessons to teach to anyone today? Does London have lessons to teach, right? Etc., etc. So yes, there's a double standard, but that's actually not where the problem lies. Is the change has to happen from within. So I'm sorry to say, but in a sense, on the one hand, the change has to happen from within, and on the other hand, it is initiatives exactly like the London story. Doing things in India, sharing that knowledge and seeing what could be done elsewhere. But it's a change that happens from the base and from within. There's no shortcut to that. It's not external pressure that's going to make any blind bit of difference. Putin is not shaking in his boots because of Navalny and a few wagging of the fingers outside. He's perfectly happy where he is. And that's not what's going to change things.
Thank you. Well, that was very nice. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to end now because we've gone a little over the hour, which we promised. And well, I would just want to say thank you, Simone, Fredrik, Manzoor, and all of you listening in. Again, on behalf of the London Story, join us again for our next live webinar. Keep looking for them on our website and we'll let you know. Thank you again and good night.